Both of our guest lecturers this semester are recent PhDs, which I think is a wonderful indication of the vibrant present and future of the field of Jewish studies. The certificate program and the lecture series have been supported by the Jewish Federation of Central California, the College of Social Sciences, and the Jewish Studies Association, which is a student group, and you can also sign up if you'd like to get information about that. Today's event is also co-sponsored by Africana Studies in honor of African Peoples History Month. So this is the first event of what I hope will be many, exploring the historic and dynamic relationship between people of Jewish and African descent. Jews live all over the world. There are Jews everywhere, from India to Argentina. Not so many, but they're there. We're a tiny minority group. But of all the different peoples Jews have been in contact with, our relationship with African Americans is particularly important and special. And not just because of Sammy Davis Jr. There are many besides Sammy Davis who are both African American and Jewish, including Michelle Obama's cousin, who is a rabbi in Chicago. There's so much that brings our two communities together, so much that we share. For example, a number of Jewish Americans were co-founders of the NAACP alongside prominent African Americans. Decades later, Rabbi Heschel was one of many rabbis who marched with Martin Luther King. The Jewish community is also so proud that over half of the white students on the Freedom Rides were Jewish. And though we all have heard about the tragedy of the 3 civil rights workers who were killed in Mississippi, not everyone knows that the 2 young white men who were brutally murdered along with their African-American comrade were both Jews. Why have Jews been so committed to civil rights and justice for African Americans? Jewish religious texts and culture teach these values. And significantly, Jews and people of African descent have a shared history of enslavement, and for Jews that occurred not only in biblical times, but also not so very long ago in the slave labor camps of Nazi Germany. Yes, we have both experienced enslavement, persecution, and denigration over centuries. The term diaspora came out of the Jewish experience of traumatic expulsion and scattering in the ancient world, and was next applied to the African experience of forced dispersion during the slave trade. The word ghetto was coined nearly 500 years ago to name the neighborhood in Venice, Italy, where Jews were restricted to live by law. Yes, there was a form of Jim Crow in Europe, but nobody back then was trying to pretend that separate was equal. Jewish communities were periodically subjected to assault and murder, justified by lies, distinct from, but not unlike, in purpose, the lies that justified lynching. Some Jews and blacks in America have been targeted by the same group, like the KKK and the white supremacist neo-Nazi groups that are still around today. Both Jewish mothers and black mothers have been ridiculed and worse in distinctive ways. Why? Because there are those, including some men within our own communities, who find their strength, intelligence, and fortitude just a little bit threatening. Jews dream, like African Americans once dreamed, of a U.S. president from among our ranks. And speaking of the president, during the 2012 campaign, which might be to the chagrin of a few people in the room, over 70% of Jewish Americans voted for Barack Obama. And, by the way, both of his chiefs of staff have been Orthodox Jews. Of course, where there is pride, there can also be shame. There have been moments of tension and difficulty between our two communities, both anti-Semitism in the black community and racism in the Jewish community, both in the United States and in Israel. It is painful to acknowledge, and in future events like this one, I hope we can address that topic in addition to learning more about the Jews of Ethiopia, how to teach children about the Holocaust and slavery, about passing and intersections in American popular music. I want to share with you also why the connection between African American and Jews is meaningful to me personally. I was raised in a liberal, Jewish, anti-racist family, and I do make the distinction here between a non-racist and an anti-racist family. My grandmother headed the first integrated Girl Scout troop in Hackensack, New Jersey in the 1940s, while my mother sat in the back of the classroom with the other few Jewish and black students who were put there by their racist teacher. Decades later, my parents were part of the first, of the now famous Black Jewish Coalition that elected the first and only black mayor of Los Angeles, Tom Bradley. My mom served on his executive staff for all of his 20 years as mayor, and she really considered him a second father. And since it was just mentioned at the Obama Forum last week about Obama as a new role model for black male masculinity, I want to remind everyone, it's kind of a family initiative to do so, that it was a dignified, intelligent, and capable black man who oversaw the flawless 1984 Olympics, preparations for which included a major revamp of LAX, where there is today a Tom Bradley terminal. So I want to just throw out all of that kind of information about the historic relationship between the black and Jewish communities as we listen to our speaker. And let me introduce her now. Leandra Sarno holds a doctorate in history with a doctoral emphasis in feminist studies from UC Santa Barbara. She is currently a faculty fellow at Stanford University. She has already won numerous awards and honors for her work, including not one, but 2 Woodrow Wilson dissertation fellowships. In addition to her academic articles in journals and books, she is completing her own book, Bella Abzug and the Promise and Peril of the American Left, which will be published by Harvard University Press. And keep in mind that she's done all this when she's only received her PhD 2 years ago. She will be speaking today about the making of a people's politician, Jewish Congresswoman Bella Abzug's first career as an early civil rights lawyer. Please join me in welcoming Leandra Sarno.
I'm quite soft-spoken, which is interesting for picking Bella Abzug, who is a very gregarious and loud New Yorker. So I will try to give my subject her due in style here. I want to thank especially Jill Fields for inviting me here today, and for this wonderful occasion to come to the Cal State system. My parents are both graduates of CSU Northridge, so they're especially proud today. Excuse me. And I also want to thank the Jewish Studies Certificate Program for inviting me as an inaugural speaker, and I bid the program well as it develops in the next few years. I'd like to thank as well the Jewish Federation of Central California and Africana Studies. And I really welcome vibrant dialogue at the end of my talk. This is a work in progress. And so this is a very valuable experience to have a conversation about my subject that I imagine will reshape my thinking about my current work. This project is personal as much as it is political for me because I became interested in Bella Abzug first actually as a student civil rights activist in North County, San Diego. I grew up in Escondido, California, and was very much involved in founding actually an interracial student group on my campus, and through that experience looked for trailblazers in that field and came across Abzug in that context. And so it's very, I think, telling that this journey started actually with California roots and yet has brought me to New York. The jingle you heard as you came in today, Let's All Unite Around Bella, served as the Congresswoman's campaign anthem as she revved up to take on the Senate in 1976. This musical tenor in this particular campaign song is very different than politics today. It's very much a Broadway zippy ditty and very different than, you know, Jay-Z and Beyonce's anthems, really hip-hop anthems, to Obama. Still, Abzug was delighted with her former legal client's catchy tune, gushing to Jay Gorney. Effusively, we gathered round, danced, sang, cheered, kissed each other, and loved it. In lighter moments, Abzug was known to belt a tune, to sweep the dance floor, to really have a mean hand of poker that she always had to win. The public persona she crafted was that of a very serious woman, in her words. She was a skilled parliamentarian, she was a tough negotiator, and a forceful street politicker. At the pinnacle of her success in 1976, she ambitiously set her sights on the Senate, keen on breaking the glass ceiling of this entirely male chamber at the time. Much to Abzug's regret, New Yorkers did not all unite around Bella, as the anthem suggested. And in fact, they actually elected then neoconservative rival Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And really that election, first in the Democratic primary over the summer and then in November, launched Moynihan's illustrious senatorial career and was the end of the line for Bella Abzug politically. Losing to Moynihan by less than 1%, Abzug would never return to Congress after serving 3 terms between 1971 and 1976. And so it's not surprising, actually, that Abzug lost this election in 1976, even though marginally. And she really was the latest casualty of a conservative political realignment underway within and outside the Democratic Party. Indeed, by 1976, the newly formed Conservative Political Action Committee brought in $10,000 a month, using Bella Abzug as a symbol of everything rotten with liberalism. She became the litmus test by which all Democratic candidates were judged, labeled as a real Bella Abzug, if their votes were too close to hers. And we can see this reflected on the slide on the right, where she is the centerpiece, the bull line of this target, and all other Democratic candidates are around. And so this kind of pamphlet was circulating in the 1976 election alongside the message that she put out from her particular campaign. Yet, in this Obama moment, historians are beginning to reevaluate the seemingly seismic Reagan revolution, to study the persistent undercurrents of liberalism and radicalism that help bring forward the politics of our own time. And I believe, as others do, that we can learn a lot from losing Democrats, such as Abzug, and we must not discount the significance that this overt left Democrat gained considerable hearing in U.S. political culture at a critical junction in the 1970s. What Abzug accomplished in just 3 short terms in Congress was nothing short of remarkable. I'm just going to name a few because actually the centerpiece of my talk looks at her time before Congress, but I'd like us to know our subject in her prime moment. Most known to us is her work as a feminist legislator, who appropriately boasted adding sex discrimination clauses to every bill that came before Congress during the early 1970s. She brought the issue of gender parity to the forefront of politics as a co-founder of the National Women's Political Caucus, as did Shirley Chisholm and others. And she shepherded all major legal feminist landmarks, from the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, that is the reason that women can have their own credit cards, maybe not as good of an idea as we all thought, to Title IX that brought women into sports. Abzug is equally remembered as the boldest anti-war legislator of her time. On her first day in Congress, she set the date to withdraw from Vietnam. We can see in the middle there the crowd that gathered on that day. And she led the congressional push for unconditional amnesty. Less known is Abzug's work ahead of the curve on issues that resonate today. She championed green energy. She introduced the first federal gay civil rights bill. She advocated a living wage for farm workers and domestic workers. And she brought money back to public transportation and urban spaces. She took on small battles, such as integrating the congressional swimming pool. And she helped make party conventions more racially and gender representative. And she also engaged in epic standoffs. She was the first in the House to call for Nixon's presidential impeachment, for certainly Watergate, but also for the secret bombings of Cambodia. And she exposed the CIA's domestic surveillance practices, which I'll talk about at the end of my talk today. In sum, these actions help create a more transparent, open, just, equal, and responsive government. Bella Abzug's diverse political interests continue to resonate, and yet we have largely forgotten her time in Congress for a number of reasons. And I have to say, it's quite remarkable that I will be her first biographer because she is such an iconic figure in our politics. Foremost, historians and contemporaries alike remember Abzug primarily as the first Jewish woman elected in her own right to Congress. Abzug is most typically attributed with helping open electoral politics to women. So, for instance, in 2008, when Hillary Clinton had a shot, all of a sudden there were numbers of op-eds in the New York Times that remembered Bella Abzug for a short moment. And it's interesting, though, that because she was not a senator or a president, her policy impact has been undervalued by political historians who have rendered Abzug and women representatives like her as largely ineffective or solely interested in women's issues. And her short congressional career really only encourages this form of dismissal. Second, as an outspoken left Democrat, Abzug operated at the fringe of respectable politics, revered by those who called her Sister Bella, and despised by those for whom she was literally the devil. These characterizations are often repeated in constituent letters that are in the thousands in her collection at Columbia University, and they really express the polarized times that pitted 1960s protest movements against the not-so-silent majority. And I found in interviews for my book that these emotions continue to run high, and people either have a revering story or absolutely don't want to talk to me because they can't stand my subject or her politics. So it's quite interesting, the contrast. Last, our tendency to forget Abzug is partly her own doing. Ever the ego, she cultivated a celebrity persona that overshadows her substantive work in our memories. Abzug knew how to work the media. She gallivanted with superstar friends in the middle. On the bottom there, you see a very young Barbra Streisand with Bella Abzug. Shirley MacLaine was one of her friends as well. And also, Bella Abzug knew how to, as she put it, put on her whole regalia. Her furs, her florid dresses, and her signature wide-brimmed hats. She also exhibited great bravado. Most infamously, she told the House doorman on her first day on the job to F off upon his request to take her hat off before going to the House floor. And so these kinds of memories are notorious. She was a workhorse, a very stubborn idealist, and she found it difficult to temper her frustration with the slow turnings of lawmaking, even when it might compel one more staffer not to quit or one more Congress member to join her on her side of the aisle. She cultivated her own version of what is now famously President Lyndon B. Johnson's Johnson treatment. But as a woman, she was not afforded the same license to practice colorful, confrontational, persuasive, passionate politics. She was lampooned in the press, ridiculed by a political foe, or the target of hate mail marked as abusive mail in her archives, and one too many death threats. It is this confluence of Abzug's private and public self that I explore in my larger biography, and I'm happy to address further in the Q&A at the end of our talk. I'm happy to speak about this period but in more detail, but I'd like to instead today really think about what made this self-described people's politician. And more than any formative experience, Abzug's early career representing workers, racial minorities, and political dissenters at the height of McCarthyism influenced her later commitment to human rights, government transparency, and privacy rights especially. Abzug's political philosophy, an idea in which she expressed her politics that I call radical pragmatism, was first on display in her legal career, in which she exhibited great faith in the courts as a conduit for remaking U.S. democracy into a more egalitarian and libertarian form. Radical in her vision, she nonetheless believed that working within the system was the surest way to achieve revolutionary change. So before I talk about the law itself, I want to talk about how she got there. And we can see here two examples from her later career. So on the left was an advertisement for her first campaign in 1970. And on the right was a picture that was printed in Life magazine where she is leading the Seder in her family, which was typically not something that a woman would do, but she really was the religious leader in her particular family and liked to express women in this position as things were changing within the conservative the conservative movement that she was a part of here. Historians have mischaracterized Abzug as a secular Jew. They have missed her early and deep devotion and sustained devotion to religious practice and her intense spiritual heart to her political work. And so one thing that I am going to explore in my book is this religious education that she was very much interested in bringing into her politics. And the synergy between religion and politics really began in her youth, in the glow of the Sabbath light that flickered each week at the Savitsky's home in a Jewish enclave in the Bronx. Abzug's father, Emanuel Savitsky, and her mother as well, were Russian Jewish immigrants. And her father, Emanuel, was also a staunch pacifist who owned the Live and Let Live butcher shop. Kind of an oxymoronic choice, but he was really against World War I and wanted to express that. But certainly that name reflected his choice to put principle before profit. And the business was flailing at best as the Great Depression set on. But the Savitskys' spirits would nonetheless soar during Sabbath. After enjoying Mother Esther's kosher cooking, the family would gather around the piano in their small flat, and Emmanuel's crisp tenor would raise the room with haunting Yiddish melodies. So this would be the language of the Southern and Eastern European and Central European Jews that was really Bella's first language, and Hebrew being her second. And Bella would join in this festivity on the violin with her sister at the piano. And to top the night off, though, Bella's beloved grandfather, Wolf Tanklevsky, an Orthodox Jew that lived with the family, would deliver the week's religious lesson. Bella found most meaning from the books of Isaiah, which instructed a peace to path. "In nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And justice, in cease to do evil, learn to do good, devote yourself to justice." It is from these formative teachings that Abzug developed a religiously grounded sense of social justice. As she later explained, it was not just enough to seek a way out of poverty or a way out of discrimination for ourselves, but for others. And that's essentially a very Judaic concept, a very simple sense of justice, modeled in the household from which I came. Joining study of Judaism and Zionism in her junior high days, Abzug became a dedicated shomer, or scout, active in the Ken Bronx, a troop of the labor Zionist youth group Hashomer Hatzair. In the early 1930s, the boundaries between religious instruction and political Zionism were increasingly malleable. And we see this in Abzug's case, very engaged in learning Hebrew and learning the Torah. She went to Talmud Torah classes at the Kingsbridge Heights Jewish Center, which was a neighborhood outpost of a growing movement of conservative Judaism. And this place offered Abzug her initial introduction through her youth group and her Hebrew classes to Hashomer Hatzair, which was an international movement that historian Shulamit Reinhardt has described as melding Aliyah and socialism. Like the more Christian-oriented Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts, Hashomer Hatzair scouts hiked, they pitched tents, and they sang camp songs. Yet, Shomer Scouts exhibited a heightened ethnic nationalism and class consciousness sophisticated beyond their years. For instance, one song Abzug sang, often later in life, with, according to a friend of hers, a dramatic voice and close to pitch perfect, went something like this, and it's noted on the bottom left there. Goodbye, America. Goodbye, Yankee fashion. We are going to Palestine. To hell with the Depression. So we can picture a young Bella stomping around subway platforms singing this tune while clinking the blue box full of change she collected for the Jewish National Fund. Abzug's strong family ties, however, kept her grounded in the United States and forestalled her immigration to the dreamland of Israel. Yet she remained committed to Hashomer Hatzair's particular unrealized vision of a Jewish Arab workers' state, and this often got her into hot water as a congressperson committed to Jewish interests, but not a hard-line position as she saw it. Entering college in 1938, it was unclear to Abzug immediately if she would become a Jewish educator or a lawyer. So by night, she studied Hebrew and the Talmud at the Teachers Institute of the Jewish Theological Seminary, which she attended the first 3 years of college. Abzug's student politics, however, often overtook her classroom interests, even though she got decent grades. As she hitched her Zionist star to a greater constellation of student organizers engaged in a broad 1930s student movement that included liberals and communists and socialists and labor Zionists, such as herself. Some were party members and some were not. And this potential of a really broad student movement has really not been explored by historians today. So here we can see in an editorial, for instance, that she wrote when she was student body president on the right-hand side, how her ethnic nationalist identity only grew when she entered college. Inspired by the potential of coalitional politics, she engaged in the political Zionist club, Avuka, which had over 50 chapters internationally at this time. And she also engaged in the left liberal group, the American Student Union, simultaneously, and negotiated the space in between her Jewish commitments and this broader movement. Hunter's largely Jewish, Italian, and African American student body drew deep connections between homegrown racism and anti-Semitism, and also the rise of fascism in Europe. One example took place on November 21st, 1938, when campus activity came to a halt as students initiated a one-day work stoppage to protest Kristallnacht, which was a wave of destruction in which Nazis racked upon Jewish businesses and synagogues in Germany and Austria, just incredible violence. Abzug helped plan this event that Student Council sought to stimulate, quote, what students in oppressed lands are feeling permanently. Hunter students also believed that their own self-realization was a form of academic freedom, which is why Abzug's proudest accomplishment as student body president was to work with the Black Student Club on campus and groups like Avuka to bring African American and Jewish history into the curriculum during her time in the late 1930s and early 1940s. We know about Rosie the Riveter if we turn to what she did after college, but we also don't really know that much about her professional sisters. And so upon graduating at the brink of U.S. entry into World War II and the first few days into U.S. entry in 1942, Abzug spent a couple months at a defense factory and realized she wasn't cut out for that and decided to indeed go to law school. So there are these roses of the law during wartime, and Abzug joined over 1,000 women nationwide who effectively kept law schools afloat. She was one of 9 who entered Columbia Law School in 1942 after Dean Young B. Smith begrudgingly reasoned, as he did in that year's annual report, that they would need to weather the storm, quote, through the education of women, since the more able male population had dropped 75%. So sexist traditions nonetheless were persistent during these years, such as calling on female students only on Ladies' Day, which really irked Abzug. And so she shared these discontents with fellow law school friends, her closest among them, Constance Baker Motley, who became one of the few women staff attorneys to work at the NAACP during the 50s and 60s, and went on to become a really esteemed judge in New York City. And so Abzug, Motley recalls, would meet with all these pretty much handful of women students during the breaks in the alcoves, and would just grumble and grumble, and then would urge the students to collectively share their grievances about Ladies' Day. And she did this on an almost daily basis, according to Motley, but she wasn't very successful in bringing together that collective in these years at this time. But we could see this nascent feminist consciousness coming to bear. Missing her heady, politically charged, women-centric Hunter College days, Abzug shared Motley's view that, in Motley's words, law school was an unmitigated bore, wholly theoretical, esoteric, and without practical application. Still, not all that Abzug learned in class was futile. Most important was her exposure to legal realist theory. And we can see this lasting influence in how Abzug quoted its main tenet, which is put up there on the top left. The main tenet in legal realist theory that came to bear in the 1920s and 30s out of law schools was that law is a social instrument for change. And this really brought a lot of lawyers from Wall Street to Washington, D.C. during the New Deal. And Abzug was inspired by that when she was in college, and kind of comes into the tail end of influence on the part of legal realism. For instance, one of her teachers, Carl Llewellyn, who had first popularized this idea with other law professors in the 20s, in the 1940s, during wartime, was telling students of his, including Abzug, to, quote, seek out new areas of service, to extend machinery of tolerance. So Abzug focused immediately on labor law, a trendy post-New Deal legal field that spoke to her labor Zionist predilection. It's important to note that in this moment, labor law was the go-to area to focus on among these kinds of elite schools like Columbia. But Howard actually pioneered in the 1930s their first civil rights class at Howard Law School, and that just was not in the offerings at this point at a place like Columbia. Graduating in 1945 during a post-war swell of labor activism, Abzug worked in the trenches of labor law, often the night court, for 3 years before shifting gears to become primarily a civil rights lawyer. So what led to this seemingly abrupt change of heart from labor law to civil rights? Well, foremost, Abzug had had enough of the male-focused world of labor law. In New York City, for instance, she was only one of 2 women lawyers practicing in this field representing unions during these years. So it was a pretty lonely place for women. She also began wearing her signature hats in court in the mid to late 40s when she was mistaken one too many times for being a legal secretary, and she was looking for a signal of distinction, and her mother always was telling her, ladies wear hats. And also hearing little snippets in the court, such as the menstruating lawyer has arrived, or the maidel has lost our strike, when her clients were upset when an action didn't go their way, and this started to trouble her. And last, one of the partners at her law firm, which was Whit and Kammer, began to make her carry his briefcase to court. and that really was the last straw. So personal experiences with sexism enhanced Abzug's attentiveness to racial justice. She naturally drew these distinctions, however, because she ran with a crowd of women activists who historians are now describing as left feminists, though they did not use those terms at the time. This group was an ideologically and racially diverse group and included independent leftists, such as Abzug, communists, socialists, and civil libertarians. Excuse me. Many were veterans of the 1930s student movement and found each other again in the post-war period. And they were interested in one goal, which was to build a more social democratic state focused on economic redistribution, on social welfare, and on racial and gender egalitarianism. The left wing of this left feminist milieu has gone unnoticed by, I'm sorry, not the left wing, the legal wing of this left feminist milieu has really gone unnoticed by historians. But I believe that there is a foundational role that women lawyers laid in the 1940s and 50s that were really creating radical roots to what later became feminist jurisprudence. Significantly, largely African American and Jewish women lawyers gravitated to and helped develop civil rights law because they intuitively linked their own second-class citizenship as women with that of racially and economically disempowered groups. They connected what African American lawyer Polly Murray has aptly termed Jane Crow with Jim Crow. We often forget as well to look northward when we're considering the civil rights movement in this early period of the 1940s and into the early 1950s, which is an oversight that's certainly being corrected now, and one that Abzug would not have made in this moment because she really gravitated to the center of post-war civil rights activism, which emanated from Harlem outward. An anti-racist, Abzug was certainly committed to the cause and found engagement in this Black Jewish coalition to be a welcome return to her student politics, especially after that esoteric law school days. She was very ambitious, however, and so ambition and ego drove her to civil rights law as much as altruism. Upon graduating from Columbia, Abzug